Everybody. Welcome all. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's great to have a lot of students, alumni, faculty, others joining us today. For those that may be new with us, just a brief intro. AHS is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and young women into the foreign policy and national security world, imbued with what we call the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We operate first and foremost in college campuses across the country, where our student-led chapters host some of our nation's most eminent scholars and practitioners for debates with some of their own faculty. Our 50 chapters host over 200 events a year on campus, and we have nearly 1,000 alumni who are working across the foreign policy and national security space, not just here in Washington, but across the country and parts of the world. It's a real pleasure and honor to have with us and to introduce Dr. Fiona Hill. Dr. Hill is the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. She recently served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. She had an earlier stint in the late aughts where she served as a National Intelligence Officer for Russian Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council, the co-author of one of the best, most important books on Vladimir Putin, Mr. Putin Operative in the Kremlin. She has a master's in Soviet studies and a doctorate in history from Harvard University and a master's in Russian and modern history from St. Andrews University in Scotland. She's written a book, which I'll let her describe a little bit for herself, but it's a memoir. It's a political commentary, social commentary, Russia policy commentary that we're here today to discuss with her, which is There's Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And as always, when we do this, we'll have some time at the end for questions. And so to do that, if you just submit your questions at the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, when we turn to that section, I'll call on you and figuratively hand you the mic. And by that, I mean sort of unmute you and to actually ask your questions. So thanks everybody for joining us. And Dr. Hill, thank you for joining us as well. Really excited to have this conversation.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks a lot.
Of course. So let me start at the beginning, and I was saying this a little bit with you before we kicked off. To be totally honest with you, before I even opened the book, I knew this wasn't a book about Russia policy and wasn't a White House tell-all stuff. I mean, I think that was really clear that that's not what you wanted to do. But I assume the story that you tell, your story, actually is a story about the American dream, an immigrant who comes to this country through our higher education system, propels herself to the top of her field, becomes a respected expert, moves up in socioeconomic status, serves not once, but twice at the highest levels of government, public service, writes a best-selling book, which I checked this morning is 9th, I think, on the New York Times bestseller list. So congratulations on that. And I think as you put it in the book, coming from the coal house, kind of where you grew up to the White House is a really compelling story. But that's not quite the story I think you tell, or not quite the way you frame it, right? I mean, it's a memoir, yes, but in some ways you see yourself not as a product of the American dream, but sort of an exception, if you will, to the British or American condition. I want to get into that. And you have to overcome classism, sexism. We're not endowed with the ingrained advantages that come with the British elite, especially during the educational sorting process that happens. And at various points, you even admit yourself, which I think we all do. And I think it's good for students to see that sometimes it was luck and the kindness of a handful of people that allowed you to really kind of break through. So your book is more of a call to action to try and create and restore a meritocracy. So maybe where we can start off by asking, and this is a way to kind of get into, is how should we reconcile, these two stories? On the one hand, like I said, superficially, it seems like a beautiful success, and what we hope and see, or we like to think we see quite a lot in the United States. On the other hand, that's not exactly what your own lived experience was. So I was wondering if you could kind of get into that for us.
Well, thanks so much, Gabe. I mean, really, in some respects, there's also 3 books in one, because I had this experience that a lot of people witnessed in the Trump administration, and people witnessed it because I was called, like many others, to testify as a fact witness on what proved to be the first, not the only, impeachment trial of President Trump. I mean, 2 years ago, in this time frame, in October, November of 2019, there was a closed-door deposition and then a public hearing in which, I found myself, like others who had been subpoenaed before Congress, suddenly very much in the public spotlight in a way that I'd never quite fully anticipated. And so, and also in the book is that sort of story about how America came to that point of the impeachment of a president. And because I was one of the fact witnesses called up, there's the personal element in it, because when I came to the public testimony, and this is one of the reasons that I wrote the book, I had to kind of explain myself and who I was. That wasn't something that I'd set out to do in any shape or form. When I'd first been asked to testify or basically answer questions behind closed doors in a deposition in October of 2019, I hadn't had any kind of prepared statement. I'd just gone in prepared to answer questions, to get to the bottom of what had been going on in this big scandal around Ukraine and a phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine, which had been in my portfolio. And I found myself then, after that experience, having to, in a way, defend who I was, because there were so many questions about credibility. There was a whole politicization, obviously, the process. It was right in the middle of partisan politics. And as someone who saw themselves as a public servant, it was very uncomfortable to be put on that spot and accused of all kinds of things, treachery, for some reason, dual loyalties of being an immigrant, being a deep state coup plotting bureaucrat. It's kind of a bit of a mouthful, but some of the things that were kind of coming out of some of the questioning. And so in the public portion of all of this, I opened up with my own story, who I am, why I'm an American, why I've got this accent, what had drawn me to public service. And also there was a cautionary tale in this too, because I was really disturbed by the line of questioning behind closed doors about national security and also about where the United States was. So all of that is kind of woven into this. And then, the third part of the whole book is the public policy element that you're talking about, the kind of call for action as to, how we restore our meritocracy and our democracy, which are all kind of intertwined. And something which I would imagine that students and other alumni of the Alexander Hamilton Society are deeply concerned about as well, because who was Alexander Hamilton but an immigrant from kind of the British colonies, who saw the best in America, great opportunities and a way to get ahead. Obviously not ending up in the place that we would like him to do, despite the fact that his own biography has spurned not just masses of books about him, but also one of the most greatest stage shows of all time, and so many songs and people's careers on it. And I can't kind of disentangle the Alexander Hamilton of history from the great kind of musical of Alexander Hamilton. And my erstwhile boss at the National Security Council, John Bolton, he wrote his book about the time in the White House, where the room where it happened, kind of a line straight out of Hamilton the musical rather than Hamilton the life. But there is, kind of in at the heart of this book, exactly this great concern that I had, and that I started to kind of fully process while I was testifying, when I said that America had given me opportunities that I wouldn't have had at home, the place that I'd come from in the United Kingdom. And then realizing, when I really thought about it, even in the aftermath, that part of the reason that we were there in this predicament of impeaching a president who was really, in many respects, a populist, a demagogue individual, nothing to do with the kind of the political ideology, but just in his person, that he was basically picking up on the hopes and aspirations of millions of people in America who felt that they'd been dashed, that they weren't getting their chance, they weren't getting their shot, from the world of the musical again, they weren't getting their opportunity, either politically to have their voice heard, because the mainstream parties weren't paying attention to them, but Trump was saying that he was, or because their socioeconomic place or their sense of their position in society was lost from a whole variety of very fast-paced changes. And that when I'd come to the United States in 1989, just as the Cold War was ending, and I got to the United States when the Berlin Wall came down in my first months or so there, people who were coming up behind me, people like you, Gabe, you went to Harvard in the kind of the time frame in which, kind of I had already sort of passed through. People of the generations behind me weren't getting the same opportunities. I had scholarships. I had these incredible advantages. I graduated without any educational debt. I actually picked on a topic to study that was taking me all the way through my career. I've been basically studying Russian since 1984. And I've found job after job after job in this particular field. It's led me to great career success. But for an awful lot of people, that just does not work out like that. Members of my own family, both in the United Kingdom and the United States, have really struggled and kept on struggling because the doors that I stepped through, many of them closed behind me. Grants for education, expansive opportunity, jobs out there for people without high school qualifications even, or certainly any kinds of advanced degrees. All of those kinds of opportunities for a better life or for making a life for yourself have started to disappear. And it's created a great upsurge of grievance and disaffection, especially after the global economic crisis of 2008, 2009, and the partly precipitating events to where we got to in 2019, and now with COVID and the pandemic to where we are now in 2021.
So let's dive into a couple of those things, because I think you covered a lot of ground there. So first, the title of the book is actually taken from a admonition, I guess, your father gave you, right? There's nothing for you here. Now, presumably that means there's also a contrapositive, meaning there's something for you elsewhere. And in your case, that something in that elsewhere was the United States. And as you said, arriving in 1989 to do graduate school at Harvard. And you sort of, I think, gloss over it quickly in the book, but I think it's actually important, which is, why did you decide to become an American and chart your life on this side of the pond? You know, what was it about your experience in those first few years in America? As you said, the dawn of the New World Order, right? Fall of the Berlin Wall, dissolution of the Soviet Union, the West had won. I mean, it was a very positive time in America, in a lot of places at least. So maybe you could give that, get into it for us a little bit, sort of like, why did you choose to kind of make your life here?
Well, I mean, what really attracted me, you know, in the first instance when I came to graduate school, he was the promise of America. I'd actually never visited America before I ended up at Harvard. So, I mean, you know, quite the wait for your first visit, you know, to get a scholarship to Harvard and, you know, kind of go to graduate school. I had all kinds of ideas of America, all of them very positive. I mean, I describe in the book how actually sometimes there were a bit of a rude awakening when I found the realities of some of the issues that I thought were, you know, either not present or had been resolved, and, you know, kind of America was in a different place. But despite all of that, you know, warts and all, faults and all, the dynamism of America, the promise of so many people coming together in a shared endeavor, you know, somewhere along the line, with obviously some notable exceptions, there is a choice in the decision to come to American people's backgrounds and their families. Sometimes there's compulsion, you know, in the fact that you're basically refugees from a war-torn land. Sometimes there is obviously an element of, you know, repression and coercion. Obviously, people who were brought here as slaves in chains during the Atlantic slave trade, they didn't have a choice in coming, even if they then went on to build lives for themselves. And in others, there's a sense of loss, obviously, of Native Americans, the first peoples who were here, who, you know, migrated in their own, you know, time frame, but, you know, millennia ago, who then have found themselves, you know, losing their place in their own lands. So there's many different dimensions to this, but for millions and millions of people in America, you know, whether their family came over on the Mayflower, so to speak, or different waves of immigration, there was a promise of being able to find something new for yourself. And if not for yourself, then for your children and grandchildren and subsequent generations. And even those who were enslaved or, you know, have kind of lost their, you know, positions, always feel that there's a promise to education in particular to get ahead. And education in the United States has been an incredible door, you know, for people. Many of the stories, what about Alexander Hamilton? He came here to be educated. And, you know, the people,
On
you
a
know, he left
scholarship.
behind. Yeah, for a scholarship
Okay.
made it possible for him. Same, you know, for me too, I think about that, you know, on so many occasions, that many of the people who came here, there were benefactors, people who went out of their way to make it possible for them. But there was within the educational system in the United States ingrained roles of benefactors. Public universities, you know, kind of community colleges, you know, state universities that, you know, provided for the people, the residents. The GI Bill wasn't there for everyone, but it expanded education after World War II. The Pell Grants, my husband and all of his family went to university colleges first in their families, you know, on Pell Grants. My husband's one of 12, and all of his siblings had their education all paid for. The private sector offering endowments and retraining and qualifications and skills. My husband's family also had money from his father's employer, which was, you know, one of the big corn products, one of you know, the big corporations. There's always in, you know, kind of the American fabric an opportunity for someone to get ahead, particularly through education. That has actually ground to a halt, which is, you know, extraordinarily disturbing. We talk now about education being the great dividing line between the haves and the have-nots, between the people who are going to be able to move on to the future and as the economy changes, the knowledge economy, but beyond that, artificial intelligence, the green economy, the new technology will require more qualifications, more specialized qualifications, the opportunity to constantly retrain. And that's really not there. We've put that on emphasis on the individual. It isn't a kind of collective effort. A scholarship and the idea of a benefactor, that's kind of an investment in everyone's future, right? In everyone's success. And we've kind of lost that, especially since the 1980s. And so I worry a great deal that is our real fault line right now. This is politically as well about how people vote or how they see themselves and how they see their place in society.
Do you think that's just in your mind in the United States, or it's worse in the United States than it was 20 years ago? Or do you think that this is actually not anything unique to the United States, but it's about society as a whole?
Yeah, it's not unique to the United States. In fact, the same thing has happened in the United Kingdom. There's been an expansion of educational opportunities, but at the individual's expense rather than at society's. In previous points in the United Kingdom, I described that in the book, I benefited enormously from an opening up of education to working class, blue collar, what we say middle class, kids. But there was also some money behind that to help that happen, because for many people, there's a barrier to entry. Even if you never pay back the loan, it becomes a burden. And certainly for minority and other disadvantaged groups in the United States, that burden of educational debt just stays with them forever. In the United Kingdom, you're paying back a student loan is dependent on your salary level, your income level. In the United States, it's dependent on what you owe. Hundreds of thousands of dollars can stop people from actually moving on with a job, particularly if they don't come already from an elite or educated background. Our meritocracy, as many people have written about, has become, kind of rather constrained, because the people who rise up in merit are usually coming from affluent backgrounds, already educated backgrounds. We're making it harder and harder for someone like an Alexander Hamilton, or a Fiona Hill or something to kind of break into here. Not just, actually for immigrants, sometimes it's a little easier, but for people here in America from a blue collar, working class background or, disadvantaged minority background, the barriers to entry have become greater. And that is something that is particular to the United States, because it isn't, kind of where the United States certainly started off in the mid parts of the 20th century. The whole emphasis has been on investment in human capital and kind of rebuilding and renewing the state, particularly after World War II. And we've kind of gone on a sort of declining slope since then.
So your daughter makes a couple cameos in your book, sometimes at inopportune moments, or which I'm sure now you can laugh at maybe, but in the moment, probably not so funny. Would you give your daughter the same sort of admonition that your father gave you 40 years ago? Or do you think that the situation today in the United States, or your particular situation, her situation, whatnot, is more positive, let's say, than you should leave?
Well, not where I live, no. Unless the political situation takes some dreadful turn, which I also worry greatly about. But if I were living in parts of the old Rust Belt, the old coal country of West Virginia, Lehigh Valley, somewhere like that, the correlate of my hometown in the north of England, then yeah, I would. And in fact, since the book came out, at the beginning of October, I've been getting notes and letters from people all the way around the country saying that's what their father or mother, said to them when they were growing up in a particular area of economic deprivation and lack of opportunity. Small towns and cities. I just got an email this morning from a professor in Flint, Michigan, who said this is what he's told his own kids. Although he has a job, he's told his kids don't come back to Flint, Michigan, and talking about the massive decline just in the population there and in opportunities there with the closure of the auto manufacturing, and of course then the tragedy of the contamination of the water supplies, etc. So lots of places can't really provide extensive opportunity. I'm going to be 56 tomorrow, and I've got friends who I went to school with in the UK. Yeah, but it's kind of like one of those. I'm making myself remember it. I'm getting close to 60 now. But I have friends in the UK who left school with me who've never had a full-time job, and it's not for lack of trying or lack of ability, but just they'd stayed in my hometown and they just couldn't find a job that was sustainable. Now, all of us are going to have to change jobs and change, kind of professions and reskill. We're all going to have to do that over time, and we'll have to deal with new technology. But, for a job that's kind of sustainable for more than a few years at a time, it doesn't give you enough kind of capacity to, build up the kind of resources to then sustain your family and, kind of move on into the future.
So let me dive in on that actually in particular. I'm going to make a comparison. You're not going to like it, but let me make the comparison and then we can get into it. So a lot of times when I was reading your book, I thought that this is the Trump memoir we've all been waiting for. I mean, literally that these are the president's views, that your critique of post-industrial decline in the West, privatization of large industries in Britain, lack of social mobility, inability, as you just said now, of people to stay in their communities if they want to or in good livings. I mean, this is the president's, is the president's critique of American society, albeit, yours is probably more elegantly put. Talk about the closure of factories, the failure of neoliberal economics, the shock of globalization. I mean, the word so, and you don't use, I don't think you use the word globalism in the book. I don't think you can correct me. I don't think you do.
No, I don't. I mean, I talk about Trump talking about it, but I don't use it.
Right, but you don't use it. So I guess what I'm asking is, it was the president's critique of, the kind of like neoliberal free market system of the way American society worked. Do you think he was actually correct?
Of course he was correct. It's just, kind of then his, sort of reasons for, some of the fundamental reasons for it were all over the place, of course, because what he does, he blames people for this happening, or he blames countries. When, I mean, these are larger historic processes, of course. So his critique was accurate, but it's also then the solutions for it, or what he himself thought that he could do about it. Because if he, of course, presents himself, Trump, as the only person who can fix this, he says that everybody who's preceded him is a complete idiot. I mean, he said that, very openly. He also, of course, put blame on immigrants, taking people's jobs away. I mean, I think we can demonstrably prove that's not the case, and there's lots of research showing no. That immigrants have contributed enormously a lot to American society, and of course generated more jobs. And if you look at some of the most innovative companies in the United States that are creating jobs, they've been formed by immigrants who've come to the United States, many of them through education, through the portals, as I did, into our educational system in our top universities. He blamed China. Well, actually, there is, of course, quite a lot of blame that can be put on the way that China was brought into the WTO as an emerging market. And then, there was a lack of adaptation, a lack of recognition about, kind of what China was doing and how it would, basically, I think, pervert the system by, acting as if it's an emerging market all the time, and the system acting as if it is when China was already, moving along. And there's an awful lot of, work being done on this as well. Yes, the China's entry into the WTO did have a big impact, but there are so many other factors that are involved here. He was coming up with very simplistic reasons, for why things had happened, rather than these larger global changes that had actually been underway since probably the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There's a long tail, to then what happened, particularly in 2008, 2009, we have the global financial crisis. It's also very true that Wall Street was bailed out while Main Street was not. But Trump's solutions to this are not complex. There are basically, as he would say, him fixing all of this, him deregulating everything, and putting the emphasis on billionaires and major owners to unleash their animal spirits to create kind of jobs. There's sort of a trickle-down economy, when really there's more complexity into the system here. I mean, this is somebody who understood, the problem in essence, but didn't at all grasp the complexity of it, and how much difficult it would be in fixing it. He also wanted to take everything back. Return jobs to the coal fields, which isn't going to happen. I grew up in all of that. That was not going to happen. I went to university in 1984 against the backdrop of the miners' strike in the United Kingdom, which is the biggest industrial action in the UK since 1926 general strike. The miners wanted to stop the closure of coal fields. The miners' strike accelerated that, because that process had been underway for a very long time. In fact, coal had not been profitable in the United Kingdom, in a larger sense for decades. I mean, there were parts of the coal industry that could have been transformed, and there was still demand, but it was just a big issue that couldn't be resolved by a strike, or certainly couldn't be resolved by quick fixes.
And so in the book, you talk about how you came to work for the National Security Council under Trump, which was a little bit sort of the Washington network, which is you had gotten to know, or through doing some TV work or other panel work, someone who was serving on the transition, they kind of brought you in and so forth. But even if his solutions, if you will, or solution was, to your point, simplistic or not going to work, or the wrong ones, or different ways to do it, was there an appeal to you to actually working in the White House with a president who seemed to at least put his finger, on the problem in ways that certainly, the last few presidents didn't, and at least during the 2016 campaign, not very many of the other candidates did either. I mean, was that appealing to you to try and do that, even if you were, maybe disappointed, with the way in which we went about doing it?
Look, I found that the issues that he put the spotlight on were definitely the issues that needed to be addressed. I wasn't convinced that he was going to be the person to address them. I was sort of agnostic on that, particularly given the divisiveness in which he approached things, the misogyny, the racism, just the whole rhetoric of division and polarization. I thought, worried me greatly. I'd joined the administration worried about Russia primarily, and the influence operation that the Russians had launched in 2016, in the run-up to 2016, and their efforts to interfere in the election, which had created an enormous domestic crisis that we're all, very familiar with. And when I was asked to come in to work on Russia and also on Europe, I felt it was my duty to do something based on all of my previous experience in government and work as a public servant, and all my knowledge about Vladimir Putin, having written books on Putin and worked on this from the intelligence perspective. I thought we had to do something, and I thought that there would be opportunities to focus on national security behind all of this. And I was, of course, watching very closely what Trump was going to do. I mean, there was a promise there, in some of the policies that could have had a positive impact. It is true, as I also say in the book, that some of these efforts did contribute to growth, not just in the stock market, but in the economy. And a lot of jobs were created. Yeah, unemployment went down, poverty went down, but none of those jobs really had protections. And coming from the place that I did, in the 1970s and 1980s, when there was a move because, the nationalized industries had been set up in the United Kingdom after World War II to rebuild the economy. So they were taken under kind of government protectorship, really. There was also a very protectionist kind of approach that Trump himself was quite keen on, kind of slapping tariffs and everything to kind of protect, kind of US industry. Britain did that in the post-war world to basically rebuild the steel and shipbuilding and the heavy industry under government supervision. But then, obviously automation, modernization, all of the kind of other pressures of competitiveness required that privatization. And when Margaret Thatcher came in, it was mass privatization instantly, in an effort to break the unions, in a kind of end the strikes and turn, that whole economy around. But it was also evident that that would come at a huge human cost, because I experienced that. It did come at a huge human cost. When it happens all at once and hundreds of thousands of people lose their jobs right away, and they don't have the training and qualifications and the wherewithal to move into a new economy, and sometimes they can't even physically move. I mean, they can't move the place because they're stuck.
So let me go in on that specifically, because I think
please do. Yeah,
a large part of the book you make, and I was frankly taken a little bit aback by the comparison, which is why I want to get into it. Which is throughout the book, you actually compare post-Soviet Russia with actually the condition in the United Kingdom, the United States, exactly on some of the issues that you listed, right? And just to quote for the audience, I think a quote that kind of sums it up, quote, "The example of modern Russia, which I have spent most of my career closely studying, offers a cautionary tale for the United States at this juncture. Russia as America's ghost of Christmas future, a harbinger of things to come if we can't adjust course and hear our political polarization." And like I said, you note the parallels that you see, similar trends of industrial decline, inequality, listlessness, oligarchical elites, lack of opportunity. I mean, the list kind of goes on. If Russia is our preview, I guess, in some ways, like maybe we're lucky that there's a preview for us to see.
Exactly.
What in your mind, could we do differently, or should we have done differently? I mean, you have a very critical view of Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherism in the book, to the point you just made about the privatization of the coal mines, among others, in the 1980s. But the standard response, I think, in the United States is often a Thatcheristic or Reaganistic response, which is like, well, let's unleash the forces of American ingenuity and let's unleash or get rid of the shackles.
And we did, right.
So but that in your mind wasn't the right response. So like,
no, because it's a lack of understanding of, what it takes to be, be able to have mobility, right? Because you mentioned the word shackles. People can become shackled, in different ways. You can deregulate, you can kind of open everything up. But, say, in the United States, actually, for years and years, that did work, until we kind of get along to the Great Recession for many people, because we did have mobility. We had cheap gas, so people, got on cheap cars, so people could get a car and, cheap gas. You didn't just have to have a Greyhound bus ticket or a train ticket, and they could, drive across country. The housing market was, pretty unregulated. And of course, we saw the consequences of that during the financial collapse and the housing bubble in 2008, 2009. But people could up and move and, get a cheap rental property if they were able to do that. The problem, tends to be, so it was one of qualifications as well. If people don't have qualifications for a job, they don't have information about a job. You don't have across the United States, in many respects, the same recognition, basically your licensing for being a plumber or a, an air conditioning engineer, let alone a doctor and a lawyer. There's certain complexities in moving beyond the kind of physical. But the problem comes of, let's just sort of take a town like my own, which I do, in the book, say Carbon County in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, an old coal town. People there actually might own their house that they might have bought. The coal industry's gone, all the other industry's gone. They shackle to that house. So nobody's going to buy it. Or the value of the house has dropped so much that they, can't then afford to buy another house somewhere else. They've lost their job. They can't keep up with their car payments. Maybe, they didn't manage to own their car outright. Gas prices and other kind of prices go up. So they can't get out there and drive, and they don't know anyone anywhere else in the country, to, kind of give them an idea of where a new job might be. And then they don't have any qualifications. Like my dad, they're qualified on the job. They're trained to be a miner or a steel worker or something else. And they didn't, kind of go beyond high school. And so, those all become shackles. Those are barriers, to opportunity. So those people can't move unless there are some funds or some other possibilities there for them to be retrained to move on to somewhere else. And often then they have their family capital, their human capital, their relational capital, if you want to look at it like that, around them, their networks that help them to survive, which is all of their family and friends and, their kind of neighbors and everybody who'd grown up. And I talk about that in the book. And people become shackled to those communities because leaving them is like being, kind of going off into sort of banishment or, basically going off into the great unknown. It's a huge leap to have to do that. And in the United States, the distances are huge. My dad, when he lost his job in the coal mine, he cycled to his next job. He literally got on his bike for work. But, we're talking about 8 miles, not 80 miles, 800 miles, 8,000 miles. So, you find within these systems, it's not that easy for everyone to be unleashed and to move about. And in the United States, our mobility has really declined. We're at the lowest levels of mobility. The pandemic, of course, has really exacerbated this since 1947. So this is kind of the problem here. That physical ability to move has been really reduced. And we've got, incredible homelessness problems. And in the 1980s in the United Kingdom, many of the people who were on the streets of London, they didn't have mental illness. They hadn't, kind of basically lost their jobs. They'd come to the south of England to look for jobs in the new economy, but they didn't know anyone. And so they ended up living on the streets because they couldn't afford, because of, the low wages at home, or they'd lost their wages, or they didn't have any assets, to liquidate. They ended up living on the streets of London, hoping to find a job.
I think you're right that this shows up in various metrics, that the level or the percentage, let's say, of kind of geographic mobility is lower than it used to be, of social mobility and so forth. It used to be. On the other hand, it's never going to be, or the ideal is never going to be quite what it was in the UK, because,
the ideal will never happen. There's never an ideal, exactly.
Well, and also the United States, it's in our nature. I mean, from, settling the West and discovery and the nature of the states and the federal system. I mean, it's not go West, young man, right? I mean, this is part of the American lore. Now, you I think point out accurately that that's might be harder today for a number of reasons than it used to be. But I think your point isn't simply it should be made easier, is that it shouldn't be obligated. That people should be able to. I think you have another quote in the book towards the end that says, if you want to leave for college or never go and stay in your hometown, you should be able to build a well-earned life with a good family right in your community and build those community bonds, right?
Yeah, because that's the promise of America, right? I mean, that is, kind of what everybody, basically thinks about when they think about America, is that's opportunity, an opportunity to live, not just survive, to thrive. I mean, that's the whole preamble to the Constitution. That one of the main points in the Constitution and the preamble is welfare. It's not welfare living off the state, it's well-being. That kind of sense of the state will help provide for your well-being, and the fact that you kind of feel that you are living a meaningful life. And living a meaningful life can be in many different forms. It doesn't have to be out there being politically active, but in that kind of sense that you're not constantly worried about having no roof over your head, no food on the table, and your children, and you at risk of dying because of absence of ability to pay for for healthcare. That idea of welfare is really well-being. It's not about living off the state and being some parasite in society. And America is a very difficult place to actually get ahead. I think we all know that. And every immigrant who comes here always talks about how hard it is to get ahead in America. But it's getting harder because of the obstacles. It's getting harder for the people who have been born here and in multiple generations here. Immigrants, often, come in their fine networks. I mean, someone like me coming in as a graduate student, I mean, how easy is that? I didn't come off, the boat at Ellis Island, struggling to, find some temporary accommodation and then find a job. I came in with a scholarship and a kind of ready-made, as I describe in the book, set of contacts and somewhere to live. And, that's not something that everyone is going to have, obviously, but we're putting a lot of barriers in the way for people being able to find that for themselves. And education has become one of those primary barriers, because our education system has become so fractured. Kind of, we're having all these fights and debates about what should be taught in school, but it's just the access to an education, to getting a higher education beyond the high school, some kind of qualification, some kind of training, some kind of apprenticeship in the private sector. All of these are the things that people are going to need to be able to move forward, because those jobs for blue collar, manual workers without an education are disappearing. They're still there, but let's just say that they're kind of shrinking, and it's not going to be possible for people to find the same kind of volume of jobs in the future.
So it is hard to get ahead, but do you think it is, even today, do you think it is easier to get ahead in America because of the nature of our system than it is elsewhere?
No. And in fact, if you look at the prospects for social mobility in the United States and the United Kingdom, they're the lowest of any OECD country.
Okay.
And it might actually be, in some respects, even easier in Russia, which sounds kind of, bizarre.
Well, so let me turn to that's kind of the next line of questions I want to turn to, because if your description is sort of the condition, the next is sort of the consequences. Is what does this mean for our democracy and for our republic? And just to remind everybody, if you want to submit questions, you can do so through the Q&A function. So on democracy, so you throughout the book, you compare Trump to Putin actually quite a lot. Essentially, that Putin is a more successful version of Trump, if you will, and that you're right. And I'll just a brief quote, if you don't mind. A quote: "In many of his actions, they were shades not just of the tyranny of the past, which had propelled the American colonies to seek independence from Great Britain, but also of the authoritarian playbook adopted by Vladimir Putin and other global leaders over the years to subvert democracy. In the course of his presidency, indeed, Trump would come more to resemble Putin in political practice and predilection than he resembled any of his recent American political predecessors. Sometimes even I was startled by how glaringly obvious the similarities were." That's pretty hot stuff, right?
Yeah.
To be able to compare it there. So why, in your mind, do you think that clearly, most of Americans, or, at least certainly the 74 million Americans who voted for him, almost half the country or so forth, why do you think they don't, it's not just that they see it and disagree, to your point about it's glaringly obvious, like, why do they not even see that in the way that you do?
Well, look, this is kind of part of the comparative aspect of things, right? People very rarely, compare the United States to other places. I mean, there is the whole discipline, of course, of comparative politics that many people here, are part of, but, there is always that feeling of American exceptionalism. And, it depends on where you sit and stand, within the country and, the hierarchy and everything else as to, what you see, right? I mean, I see very different things from you, and you see very different things from me, because we have, very different backgrounds, and, we've come from, different perspectives at this. From where I've come from, and looking, growing up in this, period of industrial decline and seeing it happen in all of the, in fact, all over Europe as well. I could have written about other European countries, could have written about Germany, for example, or France, and, some other places as well. I can see things through the eyes of a kind of, blue collar worker, although I'm clearly moved on in a different place now over all of these decades since, I left that environment. And, Russia was also basically a country filled with blue collar workers in smokestack factories, until the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the socialist union of workers and peasants, so also in kind of collective farms. But there was, lots of social mobility there entrenched in the system. You joined the Communist Party and you could move ahead. The education system was all free, healthcare, you name it, until, basically the collapse of the Soviet Union. So
full employment. Full employment,
although, they pretended to work and they got, people pretended to pay them with the other thing that you used to talk about. But Putin rises up through that system. He joins the KGB. That's his kind of source of mobility, different, way of doing things. But, Putin is also kind of coming out of a tradition, a very authoritarian tradition, one of the sort of state in the KGB. And his whole worldview is, very much shaped by that Cold War outlook. And, seeing enemies, on every front, and, really kind of a product of the 1980s. I would argue that Trump is also a product of the 1980s. And, kind of coming out of a very different, worldview, one in which he starts to see kind of America coming under assault. It's also the superpower standoff, very, very much the kind of Cold War mentality. Obviously, Trump's coming from private family business, very different. But both Putin and Trump do not come from political parties. Trump wasn't a member of the Republican Party. He doesn't have any ideological affinity with the Republican Party. He was actually once registered as a Democrat. He's an outsider who, vaults himself into the Republican primaries and basically hijacks the party and its apparatus as he becomes, the kind of the candidate. Putin doesn't rise up through any kind of movement. He's selected by Boris Yeltsin to replace him as president. He doesn't have a political party. His family weren't part of the Communist Party apparatus. And there's a movement, the United Russia and other movements that kind of are in support of Putin, but it's just sort of Putin alone with public opinion. And Putin, who, kind of believes in the power of the presidency, which is enshrined in the Russian constitution. Trump, I don't think has really read the United States Constitution, probably is unaware that it begins with "we the people." I know I'm being very harsh here, but, I observed him at close hand all the time. He only talked about himself, and he talks about the power of the presidency over everything, not the executive branch, but the presidency. And I remember during the campaign, he said he could get away with shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue. And throughout the presidency, he's talking about me, my judges, my generals, that my presidency, everything revolves around himself. Putin actually sees the power of the Russian state, but himself at the pinnacle of it, and, basically directing it. Putin's blasted through term limits. Putin's people, around him have said there is no Russia without Putin. And in fact, there probably won't be until, we get past 2036, unless he chooses a successor. Trump has also talked about the fact about, possibly being president forever. I mean, he said this in a joking manner, but he's refused to recognize that Joe Biden got elected in November 2020. And he's taken those 74 million votes as his votes for him, which is what Putin takes his votes as, because he's constantly looking at opinion polls and playing to the polls and to public opinion, which is the same thing as Trump is doing as well. But so, I mean, there's some striking similarities here, but Trump, in my experience, was woefully ignorant about the way that the United States worked. The checks and the balances, he didn't want any of them. Putin also gets rid of checks and balances. And the point that I was making in the book about the ghost of the future is that if we allow someone to ride roughshod over all of our institutions, including the political party system, because Trump has said there's no such thing as a Congressional Republican Party, there's just the party of him. And he's creating these loyalty tests, which is, something that someone like Vladimir Putin does as well. If we erode all those institutions, including the political party system, and one of the great political parties of the United States, we run into the danger of getting into that territory. I'm not saying that it's happened yet, but I'm worrying very much about the erosion of the institutional arrangements that underpin our democracy.
So let me ask about those things in particular. So you're deeply concerned, you talked about in the context of Trump, but really any candidate about being
exactly. I mean, it could be someone else, right? It doesn't have to be him. It's
right. I know, right.
I call him, you know, exactly.
Being a candidate, being a counterintelligence risk, for example,
Yes.
right? You talk about this a little bit in the book. In a recent interview I saw you give, you said we need to make sure that we don't elect people who are counterintelligence risks. And you talk about yourself having gone through, I don't know what sort of background in security.
Yeah, I mean, my God, yeah, I mean, everything, yeah.
I know it. For those of us in Washington, we know a lot of people desperately trying to serve the government.
And it's the barriers to entry is so high, exactly.
Correct, so hard. But then you concluded, I think, in that interview saying, but we need careful vetting of candidates. And I mean, of course, this will require some legislative changes. Can you explain what you mean by that? Because I look at it and I say, look, I look at what legislative means. There's a law passed by Congress, signed by the president. Today, Congress and the presidency is controlled by one party. I assume you're not quite suggesting, but maybe you are, that this Congress and this president should pass some law that requires, presidential candidates to go through some sort of background check, and that given all of our experience with these things, that some bureaucrat is able to decide who and who is not eligible for the, I guess I'd love for you to maybe clarify.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is something that we need to really debate, because actually I did get a very long email from someone who used to do the security vetting, for a living, someone from the intelligence community, saying it's not going to be as simple as that. Exactly right. I mean, I was, basically trying to kind of think through about, what it would take to change this. And, the person who had done this said it's going to take a lot more than, as you're suggesting here, some kind of legislative change, because it can't be just on, as you said, some, bureaucrat there. They were that bureaucrat that was, vetting it. And it takes kind of, basically, a willingness for the parties themselves to be more careful about candidates. I mean, really over time, and we think back to Alexander Hamilton and the founding fathers and others, they didn't envisage such a rigid party system. I mean, they didn't kind of think that we would basically be defined in our times by these two parties in particular, and kind of people identifying themselves with party over country. And that is kind of part of the problem that we've reached as well, the fetishization of the president, the lacks of checks and balances. So the person who wrote to me was also suggesting it's going to take a lot more than that. It's going to take much more of a national debate about how we think about this, because right now our presidential elections are like a beauty or popularity contest. There's not really any party discipline there. The kind of party apparatus, as Trump proved, is pretty meaningless. And it's also for the Democratic Party the same. I mean, Bernie Sanders, when he was running as
isn't that a good thing?
It could be, but we have to kind of debate all of this, because a lot of this is sort of left to a kind of perverse form of chance, because there are where are the fail-safes there to prevent somebody who has the potential to be a demagogue or isn't fit for office to basically to get ahead? Because as you said, Trump has appealed to an awful lot of people, and the 74 million people who voted for him, many vote for all kinds of different reasons. Many it's because his policies, getting back to what you said to me before, he's accurately depicted what's happening, and there is a promise of policies that could address some of this. And so people are voting there for those policies and for the depiction of things as they are. Some people, it's for the allure of him as a person, as a personality that they've projected onto a kind of avatar. For others, they have their own agendas that they want to see pushed through, be it, judges appointed in certain places, key legislation being pushed through. They're prepared to have, this guy, as imperfect as he may be from their purposes as well, in power, because that enables them to get their agendas pushed. And then there are others who just can't imagine themselves voting for the other guys. I mean, I've talked to many people who will not, as much as they hated Trump as a person or disliked what he did, contemplate voting for the other party, because their whole identity and their whole ethos and their whole outlook on life is encapsulated by being a Republican and what that stands for, and the history of the party. And they just can't see, they'd rather just sort of sit it all out. And so this is again one of the problems that we've got inherent here in the system. And we've got other experiments going on in Europe of coalition politics. In a way, we're trying to kind of figure out how we can have a coalition arrangement inside of our own two-party system here.
So, but I do worry a little bit that some of what you're proposing, even in concept, might come across as actually as anti-democratic. And
yeah,
I say,
I know. I worry about the same thing, Gabe, too, because
I,
I'm trying to figure it out, myself, which is why putting it out there as issues, let's, debate this. I can't say that I have the solutions here. I see the problem, but I'm not sure. I mean, people who are much more skilled and knowledgeable than I on the constitutional and party system, I think we need to have a big debate about this, about how we find some fixes, at least to some parts of this problem.
And just to be clear, like I said, I lead an organization that's named after Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton in his time certainly would not have liked not only the popular vote, but even sort of popularly elected electoral college votes. Not like the word democracy, thought it was a mobocracy, right? So I come from an organization that's, certainly in that way. But on the other hand, I mean, I think you gave another interview in Politico recently that said something to the effect that if Trump makes a successful return to the presidency in 2024, democracy's done because it'll be on the back of a lie of fiction. And so are you saying that the only way he can win in 2024 is via corrupt election? Or are you saying that even if he wins...
He's already said in a lie, look, 74 million people in November of 2020 voted for him before he made all of these lies. He'd already talked down the democratic system. He'd already cast all kinds of aspersions on the safety, the security of the election, right? But it's since then, he's gone into this territory of repudiating the entire election system, unless it's voting for him. And we're seeing now efforts to basically pull out of the system the oversight mechanisms, the independent state secretaries, be they Republican or Democrat, they're taking their obligation is, and we saw them stand up, during the election. He's basically opening up all of these legal suits to, basically lay the groundwork for challenging every election outcome that is not in his favor. And he's basically said he won the election, it was stolen from him. And so the 11 million more votes, or whatever it was more than that, wasn't it, for basically Joe Biden don't count at all. And so it's that kind of, sense of depriving everybody else who voted differently of that voice, the big lie that he won the election. And, basically getting other people around him, key people who I know for a fact know that, what the election outcome was in 2020, who, basically go along with this. That is, what I'm saying here. You can't have, the American Republic was not built on the back of a lie.
So I just want to, because I don't want to misinterpret. So you're saying that if he runs in 2024, because of the actions he's taken or attempting to take, it would not be possible for him to win freely and fairly. The only way for him to win was that he's able to get these various states to change the procedure. I mean, is that what, I just want to be clear. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because I mean, it's basically by the efforts to basically manipulate the Electoral College that we're seeing with our eyes. If he is successful as this, if he wins the popular vote, that's a different matter entirely. And that we don't see, what about vote repression, vote suppression? If we have the mass turnout and every single person who wants to vote can vote, and he's won, basically the popular election, then this is an entirely different matter. But if we're in that same territory where we know that there have been concerted efforts to deny people the ability to vote in key, swing constituency, if he's successful at some of the things that he's attempting. Look, he's already been very successful at getting, the idea out there that the election was stolen from him in 2020. And that is deeply disturbing. I did not come to a country in 1989 that based itself on a lie and on where a group of people storming the Capitol building. I mean, this is deeply disturbing to me, as I think it should be to everyone else, to stop the peaceful transfer of executive power that, America has been based on the whole time.
So what happens if he is successful, as you put it? I mean, what if you subvert democracy, if democracy is done, right? And you, even some of your writing, you sort of say, shades of, pre-revolutionary America in different ways. I mean, are you saying that we should do everything possible to rise up? I mean, I don't want to put words.
No, I'm saying that we need to push back as much as we can now to call this out and to, really try to, basically appeal, to the people who are around him, congressional Republicans and others to, pay attention to what they're doing here. I mean, I talk in the book about this moment for me that was extremely poignant of President Sauli Niinistö of Finland sitting next to President Trump and saying to him, look, you've got a great democracy here. Please keep it going. Because America is a beacon for everywhere else as well. I talked today to a very, very senior official from a European country who basically said, we're really disturbed about what's happening in the United States now, because what does that say for us too in our own experiments? Because, you know, democracy is challenged, you know, however, you know, we want to define it, because as you said, I mean, different people have had a different view of what democracy means at different times, but that, you know, pluralistic experiment that we have of giving more and more people a voice in our society, opening up opportunity, you know, people shouldn't have to define themselves in political terms in the United States. And, you know, and in the rest of Europe, people watching this really closely, because for them, they feel that America's credibility is on the line, American leadership, which they all need. They think, you know, I talked to another, you know, group in Canada just earlier on another podcast, and they said that they kind of feel that the West really does depend, that kind of sense of a larger West in, you know, the kind of political terms does depend on American leadership. And if America's gone down the path of demagogy, of, you know, supporting a president, electing a president again who has just basically made lies, you know, the fundaments of his political approach, then, you know, they feel that their own, you know, polity is in danger as well, because Trumpism for them is about a kind of a style of governance. It's not an ideology, but it's a kind of a style of, as a personalization, and of somebody who has privatized, you know, many of the aspects of the government and sort of sees themselves as sort of the epitome of everything, you know, politically, socially, and economically. So this is not, look, this is not partisan. I'm not a partisan person at all. It's not ideological. This is, you know, kind of really about the sort of future of American politics and trying to put back into there the essence and the spirit of, you know, the time of Alexander and Hamilton and others, and, you know, we the people. I mean, this is kind of where's the 330 million rest of us in all of this? If we're having one person sort of define, you know, what America should be about, and about the kind of, you know, the people who are part of this. I mean, Donald Trump has told many times that many of us don't belong in his America.
So let me ask one more question on my end, and then go to we have time for a couple audience questions. And just a reminder, submit your question through the Q&A function at the bottom of the dashboard, and then I'll be able to call on you. So one of the things in the book, you write that President Trump's efforts to find fraud in the election and thus keep himself in power were, in your words, quote, a slow motion coup attempt. And you kind of compare some of the actions he took to, you know, what in your mind is the coup playbook, right? Placement of loyalists in key positions, use the incident at Lafayette Square in the summer 2020 as sort of a commandeering of paramilitary forces for political purposes, and capture the means of communication. So on this last kind of question I want to ask you. So after January 6th, right, Twitter, Facebook, a couple other places banned the president from their platforms. It's been appealed and reviewed. He's still banned and will be banned for a couple of years. We're in a different place today where some private companies actually seem to have quite a lot more power than sometimes even the government or public officials. And never mind the hypocrisy that these places let people like Xi Jinping and Ayatollah Khomeini and others on these things, which is a bigger problem in my mind. But that said, do you think that's the right decision? Do you think that these companies, these tech giants, others should be, I don't know if the word censoring is the right word, because at the end it's a private company, but making these decisions to try and essentially take them off the air?
Look, I think this is, again, one of these great fundamental challenges that we have here in America, because, you know, we, as you were mentioning, Xi Jinping and others, you know, we're fighting disinformation, you know, from the outside, influence operations, but we have them also internally. And of course, we enshrine free speech. And we've had rulings of the Supreme Court that gives, you know, money, you know, the kind of, in a way, you know, form of expression of free speech, you know, with Citizens America. And now we're in that territory of, is a lie free speech? And I personally believe that it isn't, and shouldn't be, you know, sanctioned as free speech. But then how do we deal with this? And, you know, kind of, I've quoted in several occasions, you know, recently, you know, the words of George Orwell, that in a lie, in a world of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. And people know me for just telling the truth. at a testimony on Capitol Hill, and I'm shocked every time that I've, vaulted to such public prominence from telling the truth. But, here we are in a situation where a lot of our politics is getting based on not just one big lie, but lots of lies. And there seems to be no ability to push back other than people like myself taking upon ourselves to speak out. Now, should it be Twitter and Facebook? I mean, they've been propagating lies as well.
Right.
We've had Francis Hogan, and I mean, we clearly the algorithms, but our political algorithms are structured in the same way, pushing people to extremes, pushing people to outrage. A lot of our politicians now think they should be showwomen, basically strutting around, shouting, drawing attention to themselves, stoking outrage. Our whole society has got into that kind of state. And the reason that I'm writing the book and speaking out is to try to get all of us to grapple with it. I can't come up with the solutions, certainly on my own. I don't have the wherewithal or the experience, the knowledge on many of these issues. But I think we have to be having the debate about this, about the best way to do it. I don't think that it can purely come down to Twitter and Facebook, who are part of the problem. Because, from the outside, is that when I went into the administration, I was worried about the way that the Russians had exploited all of these platforms, just like you're pointing out, deeply worried about them. And, they're not censored. And they're able to create false personas. You can create fakes all over the place. And none of these big companies, Amazon is filled with fakes of my book, for example. Apparently they can't be taken down. So this is not just mine, but, everyone else's. And, they don't police this in some respects. So these are kind of part of these big problems as well, but we can't just be complacent about it. I'm not saying you are. I mean, you're asking these fantastic questions. And I think, all the people listening here too, we all have to grapple with this. I mean, this is something that we have to be debating and figuring out how we tackle it, because we're in danger. I mean, the way of life that we have prospered as a result of is being challenged. The political discourse, the kind of, I don't want to crush in any way freedom of speech, but to have our society basically built on a lie, I know that that's not a place that I want to live. And I have many friends who fled Nazi Germany in the Holocaust. Their families did. They're taking back German citizenship or Austrian citizenship. I talked to them just last night. That's disturbing. I mean, think about how these multiple generations have changed, because they're worried about what they see here and what their families fled kind of to come here. And that should give people a bit of a pause for thought. And these are not, people who are given to hysteria. Some of them are people I've worked with, in many different capacities. But that certainly gives me pause for thought.
We cannot be complacent. I very much agree. These are real problems. To be honest with you, I worry a little bit that some of the way you're framing or pushing it forward, whether on the counterintelligence assessment and deciding who's a candidate, or even Twitter and Facebook, then comes the next question, which is, okay, well, who gets to determine what is a lie and what is not a lie?
Exactly.
And what's a candidate, not a candidate.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that I'm just framing it out there, and I want pushback from people. I mean, not just for me, but because I'd like to hear what other people, say and what they come up with. I'm not suggesting that I give some very practical solutions at the back of the book that are not on this kind of score that all of us as individuals can take and that I know that work.
Right.
But these kinds of things, I mean, we need, people who really understand all of this, have grappled with it, thought about it like yourself and like others in, these kinds of societies, start talking about this. I'm just, putting out there and framing, that in these contexts, some of the issues we've got to grapple with. I don't think that, what I'm saying on this is definitely, the right way forward. Because I said, I've already been challenged and I want to have these challenged. I'm just putting out there, how do we deal with this? And I'm sure that there are many people listening, and like yourself, who've got some, ideas and thinking about how we should do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think I compare the Twitter problem similar to our discussion in the United States about gerrymandering districts, which is on the one hand,
exactly.
I agree that this is a terrible problem, the way that it's done on both sides. On the other hand, it makes me kind of queasy if we say, oh, well, it should be given up to some unelected, commission or bureaucracy, because then it's sort of, then there's no accountability to the people who are actually elected. And how do we do that? And anyways, it's tough. So I want to.
That's spot on. How do we get that accountability? And, I'm the first to say that, some of these ideas are, only half baked at the moment, because, I didn't write about them in the book. I'm just, as we're talking forward, it's like, how do we take this forward and figure out how to improve it? And the best thing about America, one of, again, the other things that attracted me here was just that freedom of discourse of people coming up with ideas, as they do in the private sector, of there being, kind of always an opportunity to move on and to evolve, and very smart, amazingly educated people who have been grappling with this and, can kind of come forward with solutions. That the faith that I always have in America is that capacity for self-repair. But, you can't start at it unless you've kind of really diagnosed the problem and, recognize that there's a problem.
I've committed the cardinal sin as the moderator, which is I see 8 questions and we have 6.
Oh, no, sorry. And I've been talking too much as well.
6 minutes, although that's a great way to get people ready. So I think we have time probably for 1, maybe 2 questions. So I'm going to go to Caitlin Hawks. Just unmuted you now. So Caitlin, why don't you introduce yourself and where you're from, and then ask your question.
Hi, it's so nice to meet you. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. My name is Katie. I just graduated from Carleton College in Minnesota. I'm from Southern California, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about wealth distribution in the United States. So, we sort of have this really extreme wealth distribution issue. And we also have, like you mentioned, a kind of rapid increase of domestic terrorism and like violence in the United States, perpetrated a lot by sort of, in the case of the Capitol insurrection or the Nashville Christmas Day bombing, by people who feel left behind. Do you believe that like this violence will sort of increase or not stop if there isn't more opportunity for the average American? Is that how people are sort of venting their frustration? And if so, is this kind of mostly, Trump motivated, or is this kind of something that comes organically?
Well, I think this is a really great question, Katie. And, I also want to be, careful about being too reductionist about this as well. I mean, although I talk about sort of socioeconomic problems that rather a lot in the book, there's obviously a lot more dimensions to this. And in fact, I mean, there's been a lot of recent research looking at the insurrectionists of January 6th and finding, of course, that they're not blue collar. Many of them are, kind of fairly, successful middle class in many respects. But they've all come from counties across the United States that are experiencing some major change, demographic change, in which, there's much more diversity within the population, and they're kind of feeling that they've, lost their position. But they also had been affected in some ways by the 2008, 2009, Great Recession, the financial crisis. They'd lost, some assets, and, kind of feeling then, that they didn't get a bailout when Wall Street got a bailout. But it's, it's that general swirl of grievance that can kind of come out of these massive inequalities, but also feeling, and Gabe was basically getting in this and the kind of pushback, that he was giving me here, that their voice isn't heard in the political system, that, that they are not getting their perspectives really addressed. And Trump was speaking to that, saying, I hear you, I listen to you. All the rallies that he was, basically holding was, a way of, basically channeling a lot of these different voices and, their concerns. So part of it is really how the political system responds to all of this. We've got on Capitol Hill now, the discussions going on still about the infrastructure bill and the reconciliation bill, where many of the elements that are touching on things that we know from polling that a majority of Americans would like to see, some ways of improving, the various socioeconomic problems. But it's also whether the political system and the representational democracy can still be shown to really represent people from all kinds of different backgrounds and walks of life. And I think that is kind of one of our challenges, because what I fear about is where people don't feel that they've got proper political representation. This is why people should have been paying an awful lot of attention to Trump. And not, kind of in 2016, as I was worried about, did he get elected by Putin or not? No, he didn't. He got elected by Americans. And Americans elected him because in fact, he was given voice to things that they wanted to have heard. And if people don't feel that their voice is being heard, either through the ballot box or through their representatives in Congress, then they will take to the streets. And there will be, for some, more violence. I mean, there's a lot of research that I and other colleagues did at Brookings, for example, that shows, where you have a society and there is, a lot of agitation or conflict, and this can be an ethnic basis or a political basis. If you get a kind of a situation where 12% of the population like to say, well, I would take to the streets and, I would be willing to commit acts of violence, then you hit a tipping point. We're at that, right now in the United States. And a lot of polling and surveys, people feel that it's justified for them to commit a violent act, to basically get their their point across. And so while we're in that kind of situation, our politics isn't taking the edge off all of this, and people are not feeling that their voices are heard. This is where we're much more likely to see the kinds of incidences, events that you're laying out here. So again, we're at kind of a sort of a tipping point here as well.
Well, it is 11:59, and so, like I said, I apologize.
Yeah, and I apologize too, because I've talked to kind of
no, and I hope it on your end, and I hope for those who are with us today that this, as I said to you even before, I was less interested in asking you about, well, were you in the room when this happened, or did you see when this happened? Actually engage with what I think really is why you wanted to write this book. It's not, I think your time in the Trump White House is something like 30 pages of a 350-page book, right? So much of it is about how you see the trajectories, and in your case, what you think is it needs to have a wake-up call of American and British societies and the comparisons that you've made elsewhere. And so I really appreciate you engaging on these really, really important concepts that matter to all of us. So Dr. Hill, thank you for being with us. And I hope everybody goes and buys the book.
Yeah, and I would actually love to see, because I didn't get to see some of the questions, so I would just kind of, wonder if they could be captured, and I can do that.
I can send them to you.
And I would also, hope that given this as students, and this is all the future for all of us, that you would engage on these questions, because I think what we need cross-generational as well as cross-racial, cross-gender, you name it, coalitions to tackle this. I mean, we're all in it together. And I mean, I certainly, I'm grappling myself. I've got a great huge pile of reading. I'm trying to listen to, other people as well, that, as we're moving forward, how do we, prevent some of the issues that you're laying out here, Gabe? It's the risk of unintended consequences, right? You try to tackle one thing and you create another set of problems. And I think you're absolutely right to, push back on some of these issues. I'm just, trying to figure out how do we do this? How do we all do this together? And I would really hope that you would continue, these discussions, and, I'll be looking out for ideas and, solutions from all of you as well.
Well, that's a call to arms. So thank you for being with us. Thanks everybody for being here. Look forward to seeing you at our next book talk which is with a colleague of Dr. Hill's, Tom Wright.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
With Tom's new book on aftershocks. So if this book wasn't about the changes in society over the last 30 years, I think Tom and his co-author Colin Kahl, who now serves in the Pentagon and the Biden administration, it's about how this bolt from the blue, maybe change things going forward. So hopefully see you there. And thank you, Dr. Hill, once again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.